Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. Today's topic is replacing peaker plants with battery storage. This webinar is being presented by Clean Energy Group as part of our Resilient Power Project. And we have some excellent guest speakers with us on the line today. But before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. So everyone on the line today is muted by default. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of the webinar. You can call in using your telephone, or you can connect using your computer mic and speakers. If you'd like to minimize the webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can click on the little orange arrow that you see circled, and that arrow also works to expand the webinar console. A very important note, we ask that you please submit your questions and your comments throughout the webinar by typing them into the question box on the webinar console and hitting send. We will get to as many questions as we can at the end of our presentations. We're going to save about 15 minutes for a Q&A, and we do think that we'll have a lot of people on the line today. We've got a lot of people registered, so we should have a lot of questions. In order to make sure that we get to your question, type it in when you think of it. Don't wait until the very end. And a final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you a copy of the webinar slides as a PDF and a link to the webinar recording within about 48 hours, probably sometime this afternoon. And you can also visit our website to find those webinar materials. And it's a good place also to find info about upcoming webinars. So that web address is resilient-power.org. So with that out of the way, I would like to pass it over to our host for today's webinar, Seth Mullendor. Seth is a Vice President and Project Director at Clean Energy Group.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you to everyone joining us today. I think we've got a really good webinar in store for you today. I'm going to start off with a little bit of background information about Clean Energy Group and the project that's bringing you this, the Resilient Power Project. Clean Energy Group, we are a national nonprofit, primarily funded by foundations. These are our foundations that fund us listed here. We've been around for about 2 decades now and really cover the landscape of clean energy throughout the years. We also have a sister organization called Clean Energy States Alliance that is a membership organization of state organizations that manage clean energy funds. So today, the webinar is being brought to you by our Resilient Power Project. The Resilient Power Project has been around for a few years now, really came as a response to Superstorm Sandy and the outages that affected the Northeast, and were particularly impactful for disadvantaged communities. The goal of the project is to increase access and deployment of resilient solar and energy storage technologies for backup purposes, and also to lower energy burdens for disadvantaged and low-income communities. The focus of our work is really in 2 buckets. One is affordable housing, and the other is critical community facilities, such as hospitals, community centers, first responders, and the like. We approach this in 2 different ways. One is kind of a high-level approach where we try to get the enabling policies and programs, market structures in place to enable more access to solar and energy storage technologies for resiliency. And we work at a project level with local communities and project developers, providing some technical assistance grant support for pre-development costs of resilient power projects for disadvantaged communities, and working closely with local organizations. You can see here listed below, we've got a number of reports and analyses that we put out around this. We do a lot of webinars like this. If you can advance to the next slide, you can see some of the projects that we've supported over the years through the project. Each of those dots represents 1 or more projects across the country. Over the last 4+ years, we've provided support to over 100 projects now across the country, and we continue to do more. So always looking to work with new partners in this. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce our speakers today. I'm going to be kicking things off with a little high-level overview of where we are in the market right now. Kind of basically what's a peaker, why are we talking about this today with batteries and peakers, and what are some projects that are being developed. From there, I'm going to hand things over to Elena Krieger, and she's going to talk about some of the health impacts of peakers and drill in California a bit. And then over to Lucas Zucker, who's going to talk about specifically one opposition fight led by community organizations against the peaker plant. So Elena is Director of Clean Energy Program at PSE Healthy Energy, which is a nonprofit energy science and policy research institute based in Oakland, California. Elena's work focuses on accelerating the adoption of clean energy resources with a focus on realizing health, environment, equity, and resilience benefits of this energy transition. Her recent work includes assessing the health impacts and environmental justice dimensions of power generation in Pennsylvania and Ohio, developing a clean energy pathway for the state of New Jersey, and analyzing approaches to integrate energy storage into California's electric grid to realize health and equity benefits. Elena holds a PhD in mechanical and aerospace engineering from Princeton and received an AV in physics and astronomy and astrophysics from Harvard. Lucas Ducker is Policy and Communications Director for the Central Coast Alliance United for a Sustainable Economy, or CAUSE. And CAUSE is a nonprofit community organization working to advance social, economic, and environmental justice in the Central Coast of California. They've been around since 2001. Lucas joined CAUSE staff in 2012 as a youth organizer and researcher, and has worked on community organizing campaigns and policy advocacy around voting rights, healthy food access, public transit, environmental justice, education, immigrants' rights, affordable housing, prison sentence reform, tax and budget reform, and workers' rights. Lucas graduated from UC Berkeley with a bachelor's degree in political economy. Okay, so we're going to start the presentation now. As Sam said, please do submit your questions along the way as you think about them. We're going to have quite a lot of questions come in, so we'll try to get to what we can after the presentations. I'm going to begin with this kind of high-level overview of what we're talking about today and where things currently stand. So just so we're all on the same page, what is a peaker plant? This is actually a picture of a peaker in New York City. Peakers tend to run and be designed to run during periods of high electricity demand, what's often called peak demand, to be able to provide energy above what baseload generators supply, which tend to run throughout most of the year. Unfortunately, peaker plants, because of the way that they run, tend to be less efficient and produce emissions at a higher rate when they are running than, say, a traditional gas plant versus a gas peaker plant. They also are smaller and tend to be located closer to population centers, which has a lot of potential health and local impacts, local air pollution impacts, more than, say, a larger plant that might be in a more remote region. They tend to not be operated very often, low capacity factor, less than 10%, a lot are quite a bit less than that. And they only tend to operate for a few hours at a time. It's not always true, but it tends to be the case. So those attributes of peaker plants actually make them a target for energy storage because they're not operated often, they're in population centers, and because they don't operate for long periods of time. This is a graph from GTM Research and Wood Mackenzie that they put out based on information from the Energy Information Administration, EIA. This is looking at peaker plants across the U.S. There are 120 gigawatts of peakers. And the important things to note about this are where these lines are. So it's showing that 84% of peakers are at a capacity factor of 10% or less. I think they said the median capacity is around 3%, which is not a lot of operation. It doesn't operate over a lot of hours throughout the year. And the average hours per start, there are 73% of them start 8 hours or less. So when they start up, they operate for 8 hours or less. Now, right now, energy storage, lithium-ion batteries tend to top out around 4 hours, but that's increasingly being pushed further and further, where we're seeing 6-hour systems and even some 8-hour systems in development right now. This is a map, again, based on information from EIA, just where peaker plants are located across the country. The blue is combustion turbines, and the orange is internal combustion peaker plants. So you can see they tend to be concentrated around populated areas. There's fewer of them in the Pacific Northwest, a lot due to their prevalence of hydro, particularly in Washington and Oregon areas. But you'll see in California, New York, there are quite a few areas that have a lot of peaker plants in densely populated areas. So I wanted to talk about, when you're talking about peakers versus storage, there's really two things to look at. One is the technology, basically the performance, and the other is economics. So on the technology side, I just wanted to bring up this quote from Abe Silverman, who is a vice president of regulatory affairs and deputy general counsel at NRG. And this quote came from a conference that I attended in New York City and presented that. It says that, we could replace every gas peaker in the U.S. with batteries right now if we wanted to, but it probably wouldn't make economic sense everywhere. But what he's saying here is that technically batteries can provide the same services as a peaker plant. Now, some people might argue against that, but general consensus that I've seen among industry experts is that technically batteries can do what a peaker plant can. It's the economics that are more in question and are where batteries seem to be becoming more and more viable every day. So this is again from GTM research looking at the economics of peakers versus battery storage. The green line here is showing the declining cost. This is looking at the levelized cost of energy storage acting as a peaker plant. Again, it should be noted this is looking at 8-hour battery storage, which is the metric that they used. And the blue line is the rising cost of peaker plants. It's awfully wide because it depends on where you're building the plant and what kind of technology you're using. The basic conclusion that came from this is GTM research and Wood Mackenzie is that in about 6 years, batteries are going to start to win or start to be able to compete on a head-to-head basis against traditional peaker plants, tend to be natural gas peaker plants. And within 10 years, storage almost always wins out everywhere across the country in any case, which is a pretty amazing finding that they have within a decade that energy storage could technically and economically replace peaker plants as we know them today. And I want to dig in on another example, a city-specific example here. This is based on a report that Strategy Consulting did for New York Best, which is a battery consortium out of New York. Looking at a head-to-head comparison of what it looks like the new cost of entry of developing a natural gas peaker plant in New York City versus a 4-hour lithium-ion battery. What they found in their analysis is that the New York City area, New York and Long Island, has 3 gigawatts of aging peakers that are already past the typical retirement or are quickly approaching that age. And it's a highly constrained area, so it's difficult to build new resources in there, particularly when you're talking about fossil fuel plants. And that's partially because air pollution presents a major health problem in the communities where those plants already are. And a lot of those areas are out of attainment for air quality standards. So the takeaway that they had from their analysis was that when you look at the upfront cost and then look at the benefits that the two technologies can provide, that in the end, this blue line, energy storage, actually comes out lower when you're talking about capacity. So this is in dollars per kilowatt year that they're looking at, which is why it looks like a different thing than the levelized cost of energy in the previous slide. This system benefits here is basically avoided startup and shutdown costs of the power plant. And this is looking at energy and AS revenues, ancillary services, things like frequency regulation, balancing for the system. So there's an important distinction here in the way that these two economic pictures look, and that's the difference between levelized cost of energy, which is what we're used to seeing, the dollars per kilowatt hour that we pay in our electric bills, and the other one is capacity, which may be actually a better metric for this. Energy storage tends to provide capacity and not so much energy. But it's two different pictures looking at basically the same thing in different ways. Now I want to quickly switch gears here and just talk about some of the recent developments of actual projects that are in the works right now. These are four different project areas that we're looking at. This has all happened in the last year. So the first is Arizona Public Services Utility in Arizona, a headline pulled from GTM. This is a 50 megawatt, 135 megawatt hour battery, 65 megawatt solar So they have a long-term power purchase agreement with the company First Solar. The interesting thing about this is, this was a request for proposal, an open solicitation that was open to any technology. So the battery and solar that won this bid actually competed head-to-head with peaker plants and came out on top. The stipulation was that the technologies had to deliver power between 3 and 8 p.m., this peak period, in the summertime. Another Arizona project, the Salt Ripper project, has ended up just being a battery, delivering peak power to the Phoenix metropolitan area. Important part here was it's located and sited next to a population center, which made it easier for them to install a battery instead of a peaker plant. This was just in May of this year. This is currently in the headlines. It's Pacific Gas and Electric. They have proposed more than 2 gigawatt hours of battery storage projects across 4 projects. One would be the largest battery in the world if it gets implemented. And then they're being built directly to replace 3 natural gas peaker plants that are currently in operation and are being propped up by reliability must-run contracts, which means that they need to run in order to be able to provide the system with the resources it needs. So PG&E has proposed these batteries in California as a replacement to those plants. The last one I want to look at is Nevada Energy, and this one was just in June. They had some actual numbers on this. So there's a number of projects. That's 6 projects in all with a gigawatt of solar in total. But there's this one project, so the Battle Mountain and Dodge Flat, where they've got the numbers in here. And I just want to pull people's attention to the levelized cost of energy they're talking about. And this is for solar and storage, not just for solar. We're talking about 3 cents, 3.5 cents in the levelized cost of energy. That's versus the graph we saw earlier from GTM, where they were talking about basically 6 cents was right now where peakers are at on the low end. Again, this is 4-hour batteries versus 8-hour, but still it's impressive numbers and stack up with where the cost of peakers are now. On the capacity side, we're talking about at the low end, $73 per kilowatt a year. It's much lower than the New York analysis that Stratogen put together. These are for plants that are meant to be built in the future. So just as a point of reference here, Brattle did a report on the 2022 cost of new entry for a peaker plant in the Mid-Atlantic territory. They were looking at the low end of $98 per kilowatt a year. So this is significantly below that. So I am going to actually stop there. I know there's a lot of information, but I want to leave a lot of time for questions. So I'm going to turn things over to Elena now to look more at the emission side of peaker plants and how this is stacking up in California. So Elena?
Thanks, Seth. So as Seth said, he went into some of the sort of economic dimensions of energy storage and energy storage plus solar to replace peaker power plants. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the potential sort of health, environment, and equity co-benefits of using energy storage in lieu of peaker power plants, and also sort of how we can think about these metrics when we're figuring out maybe how to target energy storage projects, which peaker plants we might want to take offline, and so on, with a bit of a deep dive, as Seth said, on California. So moving forward, there are a number of different considerations that I usually take into account when I'm thinking about, again, health, environment, and equity in a clean energy transition context. The first sort of most obvious one, of course, are the direct emissions from the power plants, both the total emissions that are coming out, but also the rate of emissions. How much carbon dioxide, what are the nitrogen oxide emissions per megawatt hour? So these are the marginal emissions, and you're going to get the most sort of bang for your buck, basically, if you target those plants that have the highest marginal emissions to replace with a cleaner megawatt hour from somewhere else. I also think about background air quality. Are you operating a power plant in a place that has poor existing air quality? Does it operate a lot on days that exceed air quality standards? And we'll take a look at that in a moment in the San Joaquin Valley. Demographics, who's living near the plants? Is this in a vulnerable or environmentally overburdened community that already has, a large number of other pollution sources and so on? And then finally, think a little bit about things like grid constraints. Is this in a transmission-constrained area like New York that Seth mentioned, where local investment in clean energy also will reduce demand for that plant? Is that plant needed locally, or can you sort of, let's say, think about distributed storage or something else like that in a larger area that could reduce some of those grid needs? So to look specifically at California, this is a map of California's peakers. There are more than 70, and there are some additional power plants, some aging ones, that are typically used as peakers. I've highlighted 3 of them here. The Yuba City Energy Center and Feather River Energy Center are the 2 blue circles in between those text lines. And those are the 2 that Seth mentioned that have reliability must-run contracts, and that PG&E is currently considering for replacement with large energy storage projects. Down south, we can see the McGrath peaker. That's that orange dot above McGrath. And Lucas, I think, is probably going to talk about that. And that's the Oxnard area, where the Puente power plant that Lucas is going to discuss was proposed. The capacity of the plant is represented by the size of these bubbles. And I'll also note that the colors are reflective of the CalEnviroScreen percentile. So in California, we have an environmental justice screening tool called CalEnviroScreen that incorporates both vulnerability metrics based on population demographics, so things like income level and linguistic isolation, as well as existing environmental burdens like air quality and water quality metrics. Those are integrated together to create a CalEnviroScreen score. And within California, the 25% of communities that rank highest on that metric are considered disadvantaged. And so a large, this is incorporated into policy, and we have cap and trade funding and other sort of policy and funding mechanisms that are targeted specifically towards disadvantaged communities. And we'll take a closer look at this in a moment. So to take a bit of a deeper dive on what Seth was saying in terms of emissions, gas peakers, particularly in California, tend to be the most polluting power plants on the grid from a rate standpoint. So again, they don't operate very often, but when they do operate, they tend to have the highest marginal emissions of both greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide per megawatt hour, and of nitrogen oxides per megawatt hour as compared to other plants, with the exception of biomass plants, actually, but we can say that for a different webinar. Nitrogen oxide contributes to the formation of air pollutants like ozone and particulate matter. What I've actually plotted here are California's natural gas combined cycle plants as compared to peaker plants, and also ones through cooling plants, which are some of the aging steam plants that we have along the coast that are being slowly phased out, and a lot of those are being operated as peakers currently as well. Peakers typically have higher emissions due to lower efficiency, but also they're started up sort of more frequently and don't run as long, and startups typically have higher emissions associated with them than constant runs. So when we're thinking about, again, what do we want to get offline first, where would a megawatt hour of something clean most benefit our sort of emission reduction targets, peakers jump out as the obvious candidate for replacement. The other thing that we've found is that peakers in California seem to disproportionately operate on days that are already have poor air quality. So this is a plot of all of the power plants operating in the San Joaquin Basin. San Joaquin Valley has pretty poor air quality. The red line there is the average number of days that exceed ozone standards somewhere in the San Joaquin Basin. So that's more than 30% of the time ozone exceeds federal standards. However, what we'll notice here on the right, this plot shows what percent of the time the power plants operate on days that exceed those ozone standards. And so you'll see that there are a couple of plants, mostly peakers, and a couple of cogen plants that are operated like peakers that run nearly 70% of the time on days that are already exceeding ozone standards somewhere in the San Joaquin Valley. I'll note, of course, that the majority of the pollution in California is not coming from these power plants. A lot of it is from transportation. But what you do have is hot days when everybody is turning on their air conditioning. All of the peaker power plants ramp up, all of the other power plants ramp up, and these additional sources are exacerbating local air quality conditions. So when we think about opportunities, maybe some of the opportunities here are to site storage and operate it in a way that we dispatch it on these poor air quality days, like say spare the air days, and try to take off some of these exacerbating pollution sources on the grid. California's peaker power plants are also disproportionately located in the disadvantaged communities as defined by CalEnviroscreen, as we discussed earlier. So what we've done is we've actually aggregated the CalEnviroscreen scores for populations living within 1 mile of each plant and plotted that here. And you can see that the plants are disproportionately located in disadvantaged communities, which are from the 75th to 100th percentile. So again, these are also places where we can think about maybe directing some of those cap and trade funds for disadvantaged communities towards storage that might take some peakers offline in those areas. If we take a step back now, I think it's worth talking about the rest of the country as well. New York and other areas have additional peakers that are even more polluting, particularly those plants that are burning oil or oil and natural gas instead of just natural gas. So here we have 3 different plants, 2 in California and 1 in New York City. And what we'll see is that the Astoria gas turbine power plant has slightly higher CO2 emissions and like wildly higher NOx emissions for every megawatt hour generated as compared to the California plants. So there are definitely some huge opportunities here in terms of emission reductions for targeting some of these like oil-fired power plants. The other thing to point out is that even here in California, if we compare the Feather River Energy Center, which is one of those reliability must-run plants that is hopefully going to be replaced with storage, you'll see that the emissions per megawatt hour are much higher than the Newland gas turbine plant. So you're going to get much greater sort of emission reduction benefits from replacing that Feather River Energy Center, given that you charge those batteries with low emission sources. So from like a policy standpoint, it's important to think about ensuring that there are incentives or something in place to make sure that you're charging your batteries with something like hydropower or solar power. Because if you charge your battery with coal and use that to displace, let's say, natural gas, you might actually have an increase in your overall emissions. So a few things to think about as we're trying to figure out how to incorporate these co-benefits into storage peaker replacement. A lot of the things that I've been talking about aren't really monetizable. So of course, if batteries beat peakers head to head, great. But you might need some additional incentives to value emissions, to value environmental justice, to value resilience. I like to think about replacement from both like an operational and from a siting standpoint. So operationally, we can use storage to do things like reduce peaker ramping. So for existing plants, try to reduce the number of starts, try to reduce ramping, which are associated with increased emissions. As I said, making sure that there's some incentives in place to charge storage at times of low emissions and discharge them at times of high marginal emissions. And then maybe things again like trying to preferentially dispatch storage on days when air quality is already poor. From a siting standpoint, it does make sense for starters, the sort of from an economic standpoint and actually from a pollution standpoint, to try to replace, instead of repowering old power plants, try to replace those with energy storage as well as siting new plants. And then as economics come down, storage will become more competitive with existing power plants as well. From a policy standpoint, in California, we have cap and trade funds that are directed to disadvantaged communities. So there would be an opportunity, as I said, to direct some of those directly to think about not only, let's say, putting distributed storage in those communities, but doing so in a way that is tailored to, let's say, replace replace peaker emissions in those communities as well. Pilot projects can take into account, again, these emission, demographic, and grid characteristics to try to replace power plants. And some of the other things that we've been thinking about are trying to also sort of combine different kinds of initiatives in order to achieve co-benefits. So right now there's a lot of sort of siloed activity that's targeting emission reductions or targeting clean energy projects in low-income communities, or providing grid services of some kind. And if we can stack those funding sources together, there may be an opportunity to enable more projects with more co-benefits than sort of working in siloed areas. So I think I'm going to wrap it up there. The one thing that I would like to say is a lot of the data that that I've shown here and more data, we are incorporating into a power plant mapping tool for the state of California, both for peakers and everything else. That is going to include emissions, operational characteristics, and environmental justice characteristics, and so on. So if you're interested, please stay tuned, follow PSE or email me, and ideally that can help provide you with data on California's power plants. All right, Lucas, I don't know, Seth, do you want to mediate or jump straight over?
Yeah, we're good to jump straight over. Lucas, it's all yours.
Great. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Just wanted to give a little bit of a case study of one community that was able to successfully fight off a peaker plant that is going to be replaced largely with battery storage in California. We're in Oxnard, California, about an hour and a half north of Los Angeles. And as you can see here, Oxnard's a predominantly Latino immigrant working class community, pretty diverse overall. But really, it's an agricultural community. It's one of the strawberry capitals, the strawberry capital of the world, and some people say, and so a lot of farm workers, as well as some heavy industry, military bases of port, and so that's attracted a very, very diverse population, but also really historically has been kind of the environmental dumping ground for our region. If you see on this next slide here, see California. California definitely has a large immigrant population, is very racially diverse. Oxnard's even more so. Oxnard is 86% people of color, 38% immigrant, 84% of less than a bachelor's degree education, and about 1 in 3 residents with less than a high school education. And 68% of residents are in a household with where they speak a language other than English at home. So definitely a disadvantaged community that has historically really been targeted within our region by polluters like the fossil fuel industry. As you can see here, this is the CalEnviro screen that Elena was referring to, California's environmental justice mapping tool. As you can see, Oxnard has some communities around it that are well known for being very affluent and places with very clean environments, beautiful scenic places, Thousand Oaks, Santa Barbara, some of the greenest places on that CalEnviro screen map. And this region that you can see here is basically the called the Moore Park sub area for Southern California Edison, our utility, and so they kind of see that area as one unit where essentially all of the fossil fuel generation for the region has been historically concentrated for generations in Oxnard. And so Oxnard really has a history of fighting back for environmental justice, dating back to the late 90s, where because of the heavy pesticide use in the strawberry industry and kind of the level of urban population right next to industrial agriculture, Oxnard is #1 in the state for students attending school near the highest level of toxic agricultural pesticides. So there was a lawsuit from parents at Rio Mesa School, a lot of farm workers who were bringing up concerns around birth defects and asthma and cancer rates. as a result of exposure to pesticides, and that ultimately resulted many years later in pesticide buffer zones. In 2004, Halico is a company that had a toxic waste dumping site in Oxnard. They abandoned it in 2004. In 2007, it was the community was able to get it designated as an EPA Superfund site. In 2007, the Oxnard community was able to defeat a proposed liquefied natural gas terminal off its coast that would have been the largest source of air pollution in the county. And then unsuccessfully fought a peaker in 2012, the McGrath peaker that Elena referred to, fought but lost. And so I guess the point there is, as Elena mentioned, power plants are not necessarily the largest source of pollution in California and in communities like Oxnard, but are part of these cumulative impacts from pesticides and industrial sites and all of this other pollution that the community is really living with. And the results there you can see in some of the health disparities. Oxnard's life expectancy is 7 years shorter than Malibu, just down the coast from Oxnard. You can see here this is asthma hospitalization rates. Much of Oxnard is above the 90th percentile in asthma rates. And then when you think about those health disparities, also that for example, one in five people in Oxnard is uninsured. It's one of the highest rates of uninsurance, lack of health coverage in the state of California, partly because you have such a high population that's immigrant and undocumented, who works in agriculture, who is not provided health insurance by their work, and also excluded from federal and state healthcare programs. Because of their immigration status. And so that kind of social vulnerability combined with the cumulative impacts from pollution and that exposure to environmental health hazards really creates a perfect storm for people in Oxnard. So that's a little bit of the context. As I mentioned, Oxnard has 3 power plants on its coast, and so NRG, the company that runs 2 of those 3 power plants and is the largest operator of power plants in the United States, Seth actually mentioned a quote from an NRG executive there saying they could replace all of their peaker plants with battery storage. NRG is the company that proposed another peaker in Oxnard. It was met with huge resistance, mainly because there has been such a history of the community in Oxnard really feeling like they've been dumped on and targeted for these polluting projects. Held a series of many hearings in Oxnard, probably a couple dozen hearings. You can see here one of these hearings, hundreds of people turning out to each of these hearings to come and speak, and really led by a lot of young people, particularly young Latino women. Many high schoolers from Oxnard who really led this fight, particularly in immigrant communities. Often, adult parents are face a lot of barriers, whether language barriers or immigration status, to kind of participating in government processes. And young people really kind of took the lead here. So in Oxnard, this was actually opposed. This project, after years of just staunch community opposition. It was actually opposed by every single elected official representing Oxnard, from unanimously on the city council to the county supervisor, state assembly member, state senator, congresswoman. And yet the project kind of continued to steamroll on. California has something called the Warren-Alquist Act that says that basically local land use and zoning and any kind of local decision making really has no power to stop a power plant. Power plants can only be approved or rejected by the California Energy Commission. And so these hearings were held by these state agencies, and as well as the hearings in Oxnard, many of the community activists traveled up to San Francisco, Sacramento to speak at hearings for some of these state agencies. You can see there a hearing in San Francisco at the California Public Utilities Commission. So the community really, after years of coming out and speaking and giving their 3-minute comments at these hearings over and over again, and the project kind of continuing to move forward and really felt like they weren't being listened to, began to kind of escalate their opposition to the project. Ultimately, resulting in a civil disobedience where community activists shut down a California Energy Commission meeting, one of those dozens of meetings, kind of linked arms and were willing to get arrested. Ultimately, didn't. But that point of escalation really is the point where this started to get media attention from outside of Oxnard and attention from elected officials from outside of Oxnard. So this was in early 2017, after the project had kind of been moving for 3 years, starting in 2014. And after that, it kind of all happened at once pretty fast. These are all clips from Ventura County Star headlines. That's protests to short circuit Oxnard power plant meeting. That's that civil disobedience. Shortly after that, you had 8 state senators in California, including the president of the Senate, write a letter urging the California Energy Commission to take a deeper look at this project and hold off their approval until they do further analysis. Tom Steyer, kind of big national environmental activist, came out to Oxnard and lent his support for the community's fight against this power plant. Started getting a lot of attention from national media, national figures, and kind of the energy and environmental world, as well as state lawmakers and elected officials. So there you have then regulators saying they're going to suspend a decision on it, hold off, and do further study. They asked CAISO, who runs the grid in California, to do an analysis of whether the energy needs could be met without this power plant through a combination of solar, battery storage, and any other sources. And that study took a few months and came back saying yes, absolutely. There, gave 3 different scenarios where essentially the falling cost of battery storage made viable replacing this peaker. Then kind of the big moment came in the end of 2017 when the California Energy Commission, the two commissioners who were kind of in charge of reviewing this project, essentially sent a letter to SoCal Edison, our utility company, saying that they're going to recommend denying this power plant because of the environmental impacts on the community that didn't seem like they could be mitigated, and the potential for alternatives. And that Edison should go ahead and start looking at alternatives now if they were hoping to get energy online by the year 2020. At that point, NRG, the operator of the power plants, asked for a suspension of their proposal. They wanted to put it on hold while Edison sought alternatives, rather than having their project be completely rejected, which would have set a bad precedent for them and result in kind of the final death of their project. So Edison went forward and put out an RFP and met some of the need through improved transmission, and then the remaining need put out there for companies to bid. They held some bidders conferences. Huge interest from clean energy companies from across the country. Standing room only meetings for folks interested in bidding on the project. And actually, just at the beginning of this week, Edison had closed their bidding process and just gave a kind of update to the community in a stakeholder meeting, and actually received 10 times the number of megawatts that they were seeking in bid proposals from energy developers. So clearly, huge interest, and 60% of those megawatts were through battery storage. So Edison now is really looking at no gas-fired power plants in Oxnard. And here are 2 Ventura County Star, our local newspaper headlines, about a year apart, a little over a year apart, showing just how much the tide was really changed by this community activism. From Oxnard power plant approval seems inevitable to is Puente a turning point in our energy future. Puente being the name of the power plant. Interestingly, Puente is bridge in Spanish, which NRG was saying this is kind of a bridge to the clean energy future. We're not there yet. We're not ready to have clean energy completely, but the community really made clear that we're already there. We don't need a bridge. And so here's the community kind of celebrating the victory. Really incredible result that is kind of creating ripples throughout the country. And so I'll end there.
Thank you, Lucas. That's great news on the bids that Edison has received. That's exciting to hear. And thank you, Elena. That's great. And we have, as I figured, we have a lot of questions. So I'm just going to apologize up to front to people. We're not going to get to them all, and I'm going to have to kind of pick and choose which ones we address as being the most applicable. So I'm going to start off addressing a couple of things that I can answer that have come up. We had a number of questions early on about a couple of slides that I showed looking at economic comparisons and the assumptions that go into that. I don't really have the time to address all of them, but one thing people did want to know about was what was accountable for the rising costs of peaker plants, the natural gas peaker plants over time, and also how does the volatility of gas prices come into play. And so that kind of one question answers the other one a bit, that the rising costs tend to be because of the expected rise in the commodity price of natural gas over time, particularly in the U.S. as they're opening up the LNG markets to international export. And the volatility, the market volatility, certainly plays into the cost of these. A lot of energy companies actually hedge their investments in natural gas because of the volatility, which adds more cost to a project. In talking to the folks at Arizona Public Service, they actually said that one of the reasons that they were so much in favor of going with solar and storage is because of the volatility in gas prices and because they didn't want to see more gas on their system. They want to diversify their portfolio more. So another question that came up, we are typically talking about natural gas when we're talking about these. Peaker plants can work off of a number of different fuel types. Typically it's oil or natural gas, and some run off of both. But most of the comparisons that we're looking at here are natural gas. Another technology question that came up, peakers is a pretty broad term that covers a lot of things. There's combustion turbines and there's internal combustion engines, but within both of those, there are multiple technologies. A couple of people asked about reciprocating internal combustion engines, what are known as RICE peakers, and those have a faster response time than traditional combustion turbines. When utilities are increasingly investing in these RICE facilities, because they are quick ramping and because they have a lot more flexibility and they're a lot more nimble than combustion turbines, which those are exactly the same things that you get with a battery. RICE also comes at a cost premium than combustion turbines. At the conference I attended, a representative from Fluence, which develops battery storage, so that the actual capital cost, the investment cost of batteries, is actually lower than the upfront investment cost of RICE. So batteries are actually less expensive than those, whereas they're a bit more than the upfront cost of a combustion turbine. So I just want to get those kind of questions addressed because those are the ones that I can do. Elena, I had a question that I think you could probably address. A question about the environmental justice screen, the EPA screen versus the Cal Enviro screen. Do you know what the differences are between those tools?
Yeah, so they're using slightly different data sets and have slightly different metrics. One of the sort of advantages of the California screening tool is that it provides specific data on each of the individual metrics, but then aggregates them into both a demographic score, an environmental burden score, and then an aggregate total score. In the case of the EPA's EJ screen, unless they've changed things in recent months, because I haven't looked at it for a few months, they have a lot of specific demographic information and environmental information, but do not integrate across all of those metrics to create a net score. So I actually, for some of my work, have independently created my own index based on EJ screen and based on those indicators, but had to sort of rank them separately the way that Cal and BioScreen does. They do have a demographic index that pulls together race and income, or I think race and poverty level. Cal and BioScreen actually used to include race and no longer does. So that's a quick overview.
Okay, great. It sounds like you've done a lot of work on that. So if anybody has any specific questions, reach out to Elena or let me know, and I'll pass along the question to Elena, make sure that she gets that to you. This was an interesting question that came up, and Lucas, maybe you can address this because it is a tough kind of balance. Someone was talking about how the peaker plants, particularly the existing plants, tend to be a big source of local jobs as well. Even if folks are not happy about the emissions impact, how do you balance that need for jobs versus the environmental downsides to peaker in the communities?
Yeah, that was certainly an issue throughout the throughout the campaign. The interesting thing is that actually the peakers themselves actually provide very little local jobs. I mean, the peaker that was proposed, I think it was going to create 17 jobs. And the vast majority of those were going to be from outside of the area, just folks they bring in from somewhere else because they require technical skills. I mean, a lot of these plants are pretty heavily automated at this point. The real job creation is actually in the construction of the plants, which are good paying jobs that are often union jobs and are prevailing wage, but are temporary, right? So there would have been maybe I think 50 to 100 kind of short-term jobs in the construction of that for a few months, right? But I think ultimately, when we think, say, a community like Oxnard, you've got thousands and thousands of jobs in agriculture, which is being impacted by drought and being impacted by saltwater intrusion from climate change, right? And so, really, argue that the negative impact on jobs of fossil fuels for a community like Oxnard is actually much greater than the job gains. But I think that's also why in these campaigns it's so important to really be organizing local people, because I think the industry will always come in and say, oh, jobs, how you environmentalists, privileged environmentalists coming in here and saying that you don't want this, the people here need the jobs, and then that's able to be really ground truth by local people coming out and saying, well, this isn't actually really going to create much jobs for us at all, and this is really polluting and negatively impacting our community. I hope that kind of answered that question.
Yeah, no, that was an excellent answer. Thank you, Lucas. And this brings up an interesting point. And someone else raised the question about, what about big batteries, decentralized kind of battery installations versus more distributed resources, and then the balance between those. The projects that I showed, those tend to be big batteries. Those are multi-megawatt batteries and sometimes paired with big solar installations. But one of the projects proposed by Pacific Gas and Electric, PG&E, is actually distributed energy storage that's going to be installed in a number of businesses throughout the area and then aggregated together to act as one big battery, as an aggregated resource. So it allows for the systems to be, for some of the revenue generation that the peaking ability provides, to be distributed throughout a community and not just concentrated with one big company that develops and operates the thing. Particularly in California, a lot of businesses face charges that batteries can lower the cost for those businesses throughout the year, and then they can tap into revenue when called upon to provide peaking capacity. So it doesn't have to be just big installations like a power plant with batteries. It can also be distributed throughout a community. So it's a big difference between how these things are deployed. I had a very good question, and Elena, I'm thinking this is something that you've thought about, but Lucas, please chime in if you've got an answer to this as well. Have you seen examples of communities getting existing plants to reduce their operations during ozone alert days, so operating less on days where the air quality is poor?
So I wanted to make a quick comment on the last question on distributed
Sure.
generation. Just to throw out there that, again, distributed storage, if designed well, also has opportunities to provide resilience benefits in the case of emergencies. So if those are, again, valued and priced, that may encourage additional distributed storage. We are currently in discussions with some organizations and local utilities about actually doing more demand response as opposed to storage to reduce peaker operation on poor air quality days. So that is something that we're starting to think about, but it is not yet active. And that's coming into some of the discussion about demand response in disadvantaged communities at the Public Utilities Commission here in California. There are also some existing regulations in New Jersey, I believe. They have a high electric demand day rule, where on particularly high electric demand days, which are also associated typically with poor air quality, there is a rule that you're not allowed to run the most polluting plants. But in that case, that typically addresses, I think, mostly coal plants and not as much peakers. That I do not believe, again, though, is a community organizational thing and more of a larger regulatory decision. Anyway, Lucas, do you have anything?
No.
Okay. Another question that came up from a couple of folks, and this gets into some tricky territory that's been debated, is for standalone batteries that are not specifically paired with a renewable generation, how can you identify the source of charging for that battery? So if you're trying to reduce emissions, how can you ensure that that's clean energy going into that? And related to that, just using batteries instead of peaker plants, ensure that you are going to have lower emissions. I can address this first, and then please jump in, Elena or Lucas, if you have any thoughts. I think batteries don't necessarily ensure that you're going to lower emissions on the systems. There have been some folks that have argued that they will actually raise it in places where you have a lot of coal generation. But under the right pricing structure or the right market signals, they certainly can. And make sure that the batteries are charged at times when there are low emissions on the systems or low emissions generating resources. Certainly times when you're curtailing solar or wind in places where have high penetration, which does happen regularly in a number of states right now. So there are a number of ways to get about that, but putting batteries in the system doesn't necessarily mean lower emissions. But what it does do is it makes the system more flexible, which can allow you to incorporate more variable resources like solar and wind. So Elena, Lucas, not sure if you guys had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I was just going to add that there are organizations like WattTime, and I know that the South Coast Air Quality Management District, which governs air quality here in California, is also thinking about this, are modeling the marginal emissions, so the power plant that is most likely to be dispatched at any given load level, and using that to say, like, all right, this marginal power plant that would come on or wouldn't for that additional load from charging your storage or from discharging it, associating that with what the footprint would be for storage. And so WattTime and others will allow you to actually look at that signal and even schedule your storage charging and discharging in accordance with what those marginal emissions on the grid typically are based on that load.
Great. Thank you for that. So it looks like we're just about out of time here. I'm just going to address a couple of other general questions that came in, and I think we're going to close it out after that. Just a couple of things people are asking about, what battery technologies are we talking about? Typically, we're talking about lithium-ion batteries. All the proposed projects that I've seen so far have been lithium-ion. More than 90% of the battery storage that's going in there is lithium-ion. There was some question about more exotic things like compressed air storage that are being deployed some, but not really in wide scale at this time. Those we really just haven't seen a whole lot. There is a question of flow batteries as well, which have been deployed more. Have not seen them specifically deployed for these kinds of large scale kind of peaker replacement things, although they have been deployed in some places to lower peak demand behind the meter, so at a customer site. they're still considered, you know, a less well-known technology and are not really widely deployed as compared to lithium-ion. One advantage they do have is a longer duration. Same thing with compressed air, much longer duration. But flow batteries often get more into that 8 to 10-hour range, whereas lithium-ion, they're mainly at the 4-hour, but we're seeing longer and longer projects. Another question that came up is ancillary services, which is basically providing grid services like frequency regulation, whether batteries can tap into those to make a better economic case. They definitely can. Some folks argue that those markets are fairly small and can be saturated pretty quickly. There are a number of ancillary services out there that are bigger, but that's certainly one thing that, particularly in the beginnings when you're first just getting a few batteries, that's often a very lucrative market for them to play in, depending on the territory. With that, I think I'm going to have to close it off to questions. I want to thank you very much to Elena and Lucas, because this was just a great presentation. I think we covered a lot of areas here. There's a lot more to cover, and this is a developing situation. So I imagine we'll do another one of these down the line in a few months and update people on where we are. Thank you to everyone for joining us. I'm going to turn things over to Sam now to tell you about some other upcoming webinars that we have.
Quick interruption. Thank you, Seth. Thank you, Sam. And if anybody has questions, please don't hesitate to email.
Awesome. Thanks, Elena. And thank you, Lucas, for your presentations.
Thanks so much.
I just want to let everyone know about a couple of upcoming webinars that we have scheduled. So next week, next Wednesday, we've got a webinar with guest speakers from NREL. The topic is Simplifying Resilient Power Design with Reopt Lite. A look at the new features that have been added to NREL's new Solar Plus Storage tool, newly updated Solar Plus Storage tool. So that's next Wednesday. And then later in August, we've got a webinar that is going to feature a presentation on the Massachusetts ACES program, which is an energy storage program that may be of interest to the folks on the line. So you can learn more about those webinars on our website at cleanegroup.org/webinars. And many people have written in asking if we will be sending out a copy of the webinar recording and the slides. We will. We'll send you a follow-up email probably this afternoon with a link to those webinar materials. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending this webinar. We hope to see you at the next one.